You are looking at nothing, sand, wind, a horizon that promises nothing but more sand and more wind. The modern Iraqi sun does not warm, it burns, it erases, it devours any sign that something living ever walked here. It is hard to believe that you are standing on the bones of the most powerful city the ancient world ever knew, but you are. A few meters below your feet, buried under 26 centuries of dust and forgetting, sleeps the greatest megalopolis of antiquity. Babylon did not die in battle. It was not swept away by a volcano, did not sink into the sea. It was swallowed by something far slower and far crueler: time, abandonment, and the sheer arrogance of the men who built it, believing it would last forever. This is the story of how the center of the universe turned to dust. Close your eyes for a moment. Try to imagine, not just picture, but feel what it was like to stand here in the year 600 BC. The smell arrives first: meat roasting with spices from India, cedar resin burning in the temples, horse dung mixed with fresh mud from the Euphrates River. Then the sound: dozens of different languages spoken at once, bronze hammers striking glazed bricks, cartwheels grinding over polished stone. And then you open your eyes, and the sheer scale of what stands before you simply breaks your mind. The outer walls of Babylon stretched for 88 kilometers. That is not a typo. 88 kilometers of kill-fired bricks, some coated in gleaming black bitumen, raised to heights that made foreign travelers stumble back when they spotted the city on the horizon. The Greek historian Herodotus, when he visited them, wrote that they were so wide at the top that two quadrigas, two chariots each pulled by 4 horses, could pass side by side without touching. This was not a wall. It was a city within a city. It was a declaration that Babylon feared nothing the world could send against it. And at the heart of that wall, like a sun rising from brick and lapis lazuli, stood the Ishtar Gate, built by order of King Nebuchadnezzar II, sometime between 605 and 562 BC. The Ishtar Gate was the main entrance to the city, and one of the most beautiful and terrifying things human eyes had ever seen. 26 meters tall, coated from top to base in glazed bricks of a blue that no longer exists in nature, the blue of lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone hauled from Afghanistan at astronomical cost. Against that cobalt background that seared the eyes under the Mesopotamian sun, serpent-necked dragons and golden-horned bulls paraded in relief, the sacred animals of the gods Marduk and Adad. Each brick individually molded, individually painted, individually laid by the hands of slaves whose names history never recorded. To walk through that gate was not to enter a city. It was to be consumed by one. Inside, the processional way stretched in a straight line for kilometers, flanked by lions in high relief made from that same impossible blue. It was the road the gods traveled, or rather, that statues of the gods traveled, carried in procession during the Babylonian New Year festival, the Akichu, when the entire city ground to a halt to celebrate, and priests performed rituals that blended prayer, astronomy, and things the historical record has the decency not to describe in detail. And on the city's skyline, touching the clouds, stood the Etemenanki. In Akkadian, the name translates to the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. To the rest of the world, it entered history under a different name, the Tower of Babel. 90 meters tall, the equivalent of a 30-story building, constructed in 7-stepped tiers of brick tapering toward the sky, with a temple at the top dedicated to the god Marduk. Modern archaeologists found only the foundation, a square 90 meters by 90 meters of ancient brick buried under the sand. But the cuneiform records leave little room for doubt. When you stood in Babylon and looked up at the Etemenanki, it looked as though someone had tried to punch a hole in the sky. The Jewish exiles who arrived here in chains, deported en masse by Nebuchadnezzar after the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC, looked at that tower and those walls and wrote in their sacred texts that this could only be the work of men who wanted to make themselves equal to God. and that God, for that very reason, would destroy them. They were not entirely wrong, but the destruction that came was not divine. It was far more mundane and, for that reason, far more cruel. Before we reach the end, we need to talk about the Hanging Gardens, because they were, in a certain sense, the most perfect symbol of everything Babylon represented. A beautiful, impossible madness built on the suffering of others. The most widely accepted account says Nebuchadnezzar built them for his queen, Amatis, a Median princess who longed for the green mountains of her homeland. In a desert where rain is a near miraculous rarity, the king ordered terraced stone platforms to be stacked on top of one another, each one planted with trees, shrubs, and flowers brought from every corner of the Babylonian Empire. Archimedes' screws, a hydraulic engineering system so advanced for the era that the Greeks stood slack-jawed when they heard about it, pumped water from the Euphrates upward, irrigating every terrace. In the heart of a desert that killed by thirst, the king created an artificial mountain wrapped in eternal green. The irony? We have never found definitive archaeological proof they actually existed. It may have been the greatest marketing myth of antiquity, or they may lie buried under a site we have not yet excavated. Babylon keeps secrets. The sand refuses to give back. Now let's step inside the real city. Not the golden side the kings wanted you to see. The streets of Babylon smelled of dried fish, sesame oil, and human urine. Common homes were made of adobe, raw mud brick, and clustered in alleys so narrow that two men could not pass each other face to face without touching. Sewage was a concept the city knew vaguely and applied with uneven enthusiasm. Drainage channels existed in some areas, but most waste simply ran down gutters until it reached some canal that emptied into the Euphrates, the same river from which the city drew its drinking water. The life expectancy of an ordinary Babylonian hovered around 35 years. Gastrointestinal disease was a constant. Malaria, drifting in from the marshes of southern Mesopotamia, killed with seasonal regularity. Children died at a frequency that would paralyze us with horror today, but that then was simply the texture of daily life. And still the city grew, because at the center of that chaos of filth and disease and early death, there was something that kept everything running: trade. Babylon was the central node of a commercial network that stretched from the Mediterranean to India. Spices, metals, textiles, slaves, grain, gemstones, timber, everything passed through here. Everything was taxed. Everything left a little gold in the hands of merchants, officials, and eventually in the king's treasury. And Nebuchadnezzar II knew exactly how to spend that gold. Palace banquets were events guests remembered until death, and that the slaves who served them perhaps preferred to forget. Tables heaving with lamb roasted in cumin and coriander, Euphrates fish prepared in pomegranate sauces, cups of red palm wine filled and refilled without pause by cupbearers under orders to let no guest stay sober before dawn. The walls of the banquet hall were lined with painted tiles depicting hunting scenes, wounded lions, fallen bulls, implacable kings. The air tasted of incense and rendered fat. At the same time, a few hundred meters away, Jewish, Elamite, Egyptian, and Assyrian prisoners of war slept piled in damp sheds, woke before sunrise, and hauled bricks until the muscles in their backs simply refused to bend any further. Those were the arms that raised the walls. Those were the bent backs that upheld the glory that history books would celebrate for centuries. That was Babylon, the most beautiful illusion that money and human sweat ever produced. The year is 539 BC. The city has a new dynasty on the throne, or rather, trying to hold the throne. Nebuchadnezzar II has been dead for over 20 years. The crown has passed through weak and unstable hands, and now belongs to Belshazzar, son of King Nabonidus, who has been absent from the capital for years for reasons historians still debate with a certain disbelief. Belshazzar does not seem to care. Tonight, he throws a banquet for 1,000 nobles. Wine flows in rivers. The gold gleams. Laughter echoes off the palace walls. Outside the walls, a few kilometers away in the dark, Cyrus the Great, king of Persia and Media, the man who has already conquered half the known world, is waiting. His generals are executing a plan of engineering that has nothing spectacular about it, only the brutal elegance of an obvious solution that no one in the city thought to defend against. They divert the Euphrates. The Euphrates cut Babylon in half, and the walls descended to the riverbank on both sides, with submerged bronze gates that were sealed at night. But tonight, Persian engineers have quietly redirected part of the current into an artificial canal they have been discreetly digging for weeks. The river level inside the city begins to drop. Slowly, imperceptibly, the bronze gates that had always sat submerged begin to emerge from the water, and Persian soldiers walk into the greatest city in the world through the back door, water at their knees, making almost no sound at all. The author of the Book of Daniel in the Hebrew Scriptures describes the exact moment messengers arrived at Belshazzar's banquet hall to announce the city had fallen, as the king went pale. His knees shook so hard they knocked together. The wine cups, which tradition says were the sacred vessels looted from the temple in Jerusalem, fell and rolled across the polished stone floor. Babylon did not fall with a roar. It fell with the sound of spilled wine and trembling knees. The military fall was swift. The real death of Babylon took centuries and was far sadder. Cyrus entered the city as a liberator, not a destroyer. He freed the slaves. He allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. He honored the temples. For a time, Babylon still mattered, still the largest city in the region, still a cultural and commercial center. The Persians governed it. Then came the Greeks, when Alexander the Great conquered it in 331 BC and died inside its walls 9 years later, at 32, in a palace that smelled of old grandeur and fresh decay. But something had shifted. The center of gravity of the ancient world had moved. New cities were rising. Trade routes were bending in different directions. The Euphrates, which for millennia had been Babylon's jugular vein, slowly began to change its own course, like a river that decides it has carried enough life through here. Without water, fields die. Without fields, there is no food. Without food, people leave. And when people leave, the adobe bricks, those sun-dried mud bricks that built the most famous walls in history, begin to fall apart. Rain dissolves them. Wind erodes them. Within a few centuries, what was once an 88-kilometer wall becomes a ridge of earth you would not notice unless you knew what you were looking for. In the 1st century AD, the Greek geographer Strabo visited the site and wrote, with the detachment of a man observing a carcass, "The great Babylon is nothing more than a great desolation." By the 7th century AD, when Arab armies conquered Mesopotamia and Islamized the region, Babylon was no longer even a shadow. It was only a name, a legend, a warning that preachers used to speak of pride and ruin. The bricks that remained were reused, literally. Medieval cities across the region were built with the bones of Babylon. Their bricks pulled from the ruins to construct mosques, homes, and markets that time did not spare either. The city that had once consumed the world was itself consumed by those who came after. When German archaeologists arrived in the early 20th century, led by architect Robert Koldewey, what they found was exactly that nothingness you saw at the start of this video. Except now, they knew what that nothingness was hiding. They excavated for 18 years. They found the Ishtar Gate, dismantled brick by brick, shipped to Berlin, reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum where it stands to this day. They found the processional way. They found the foundations of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, the Etemenanki, the temples. They found the bones of the greatest dream the ancient world ever dared to dream. You are standing on the bones of the most powerful city the ancient world ever knew. Beneath your feet, the bricks that remain, because not all of them were taken, still bear cuneiform inscriptions. I, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, built and completed this. One of them reads, "The king was so certain history would remember his name forever that he had his signature stamped into every individual brick of the palace, and in a way, it worked. We remember his name, just not the way he expected. We remember it as a warning. As proof that there is no brick strong enough, no wall wide enough, no tower tall enough to sustain a civilization that believes history will end with it at the center. The desert always wins. It is only a matter of time. Babylon took 26 centuries to turn to dust. Other civilizations went faster, some slower, but the pattern repeats with the regularity that should make us stop and think. Empires that believe themselves eternal never are. And the question that keeps pulsing beneath the sand of this desert is the same one that should keep us up at night. When we look at the cities we have built today, at the glass and steel towers that touch the clouds of the 21st century, at the systems we feed and that feed us, one unavoidable thought takes shape. What will the sand cover 2,000 years from now? But before answering that question, it may be worth knowing another ending, another fall, another civilization that also believed itself invincible and discovered in the worst possible way that it was wrong. In the next video on this channel, we go to ancient Rome, not the Rome of emperors and gladiators you already know. We go to Rome's last night, when barbarians were walking the same streets Julius Caesar once walked, and no one in the city seemed to notice that an era had ended, the slowest collapse in history, and perhaps the most frighteningly familiar of them all.